90,000 Native Americans are still in boxes in university storage rooms. Not artifacts, not pottery, human remains, bones, teeth, burial goods. A law passed in 1990 ordered institutions to give them back. 34 years later, 88% are still there. Some of those bones came from the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, Colorado. To understand why, you have to go back to a canyon in December of 1888. Two ranchers, Richard Wetherill and Charlie Mason, were tracking cattle through the Colorado snow. They looked across a canyon and saw something through the falling snow that stopped them cold. Cut into the face of a sandstone cliff, a city, hundreds of rooms stacked 4 stories high inside a natural rock alcove. Round ceremonial chambers, called kivas, plazas, towers, doorways, all sealed in silence for more than 700 years. What they were looking at was Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America. Built between 1190 and 1280 CE by the ancestral Puebloans, people who had been living in that canyon for 700 years before Wetherill ever arrived. 700 years. Longer than the entire history of the United States times 3. This was not a ruin. It was not a mystery. It was a home whose residents had moved south. The Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley are their direct descendants. They know exactly where their ancestors went, because their ancestors told them, and their children told their children. The oral histories, the clan structures, the ceremonial knowledge, all of it connects living people to these walls. At its height, ancestral Puebloan civilization covered approximately 60,000 square miles of the Colorado Plateau, larger than the state of Georgia, home to a network of communities, roads, and great houses. Chaco Canyon's Pueblo Bonito alone contained an estimated 600 to 800 rooms across 5 stories. Building it required approximately 200,000 pieces of timber. Some carried over 50 miles with no wheels and no draft animals. 200,000 beams, that is the structural lumber, for approximately 400 modern American homes, moved by human hands across desert terrain. This civilization was not hiding. It was not primitive. It was engineering at continental scale. Why isn't this in your textbook? Because by the time textbooks were being written, the excavation had already begun. And what the excavators took was not just pottery. Within years of Wetherill's first visit to Cliff Palace, digging had started in earnest. There was no federal protection for these sites. There were no rules about what could be removed. Wetherill returned with shovels, with buyers, with collectors who paid for whatever came out of the ground. Between 1896 and 1900, Wetherill ran excavations at Chaco Canyon, the largest great house complex in North America. He shipped approximately 90 crates of ancestral Puebloan artifacts and human remains to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. 90 crates, each one packed in a climate-controlled building in Manhattan, cataloged with a specimen number, filed under science. The bones inside those crates were not anonymous ancient humans. They were people with families, with burial rights, with names their descendants still know. But in 1897, no one in a position of legal authority agreed with that. Congress passed the Antiquities Act in 1906, signed by President Theodore Roosevelt on June 8 of that year. Mesa Verde was designated a national monument, then elevated to a national park that same year. The structures were now protected. What had already been taken was not returned. And the Antiquities Act contained a critical blind spot. It treated indigenous burials as archaeological resources, not as human beings. For the next 8 decades, collections grew. Universities built museums. Museums hired archaeologists. Archaeologists published papers. The bones stayed in the drawers. Drawers, not display cases. Storage drawers, in the back, behind the public galleries. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 added federal oversight to archaeological sites. It still contained no mechanism to force institutions to return what they had already taken. By the 1980s, the scale of what was held in American museums had become impossible to ignore. Native American advocates, tribal leaders, and scholars had been demanding repatriation for years, some for decades. The Hopi tribe was filing formal requests. The Pueblo of Zuni was writing letters. The 19 Pueblos of New Mexico were organizing politically. They were asking for their relatives back, and the answer was almost always some variation of, study them further. In 1990, after years of tribal advocacy and congressional pressure, a law finally passed. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, signed by President George H.W. Bush on November 16, 1990. Public Law 101-601. 4 pages that were supposed to end this. NAGPRA mandated that every federally funded institution inventory its holdings of native human remains, funerary objects, and sacred items, then consult with culturally affiliated tribes, then return those remains. That was the law. Pueblo tribal leaders who had fought for this understood immediately what the law did and what it deliberately did not do. It set no hard deadline for completion. It created no criminal penalty severe enough to compel urgency. And it contained a classification culturally unidentifiable that institutions would use for the next 33 years, like a legal parking brake. If an institution could not definitively prove which tribe a set of remains belonged to, they could classify them as unidentifiable and do nothing. This is where ancestral Puebloan remains became caught in a bureaucratic trap that was, in many cases, entirely manufactured. The Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples had documented oral histories, genealogical records, and clan-based evidence connecting them to Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Institutions classified their ancestors as unidentifiable anyway. The drawer stayed closed. But what came next? The decades that followed 1990. Nobody teaches this part. In the years immediately after NAGPRA passed, some institutions complied in good faith. Most did not. A 2010 Government Accountability Office report found that key federal agencies had still not fully complied after nearly 20 years. 20 years. The children of the tribal leaders who fought for NAGPRA were now adults, and the bones were still in storage. The GAO report documented that approximately 116,000 individuals were classified as culturally unidentifiable across NAGPRA inventories as of 2010. 116,000 people rendered legally anonymous by paperwork. Many of them excavated from ancestral Puebloan sites where the connection to living descendants was thoroughly documented. The University of Colorado Museum of Natural History holds collections including materials excavated from ancestral Puebloan sites in the Four Corners region. The Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University holds human remains and funerary objects from cliff-dwelling contexts in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Both institutions appear in the National NAGPRA Program Database, a searchable public record that anyone can check. Tonight at nps.gov/NAGPRA. The Smithsonian Institution operates under its own separate law, the National Museum of the American Indian Act of 1989. As of recent reporting, the Smithsonian held remains of approximately 2,400 individuals with cultural affiliation to Pueblo peoples, including those from Four Corners excavations. 2,400. That is not a rounding error. That is a number with names behind it, names that Hopi and Zuni clan records can speak. In 1996, a legal case emerged that gave institutions a new argument for delay. Near Kennewick, Washington, on July 28 of that year, ancient human remains were found along the Columbia River. Scientists argued the remains were of significant research interest and should not be returned under NAGPRA. The case dragged through federal courts for 9 years, until a 2004 appeals court ruling. During those 9 years, institutions across the country quietly used similar scientific interest arguments to slow their own NAGPRA compliance. The delay was not accidental. It was a strategy, and it worked. Meanwhile, on the Hopi mesas, 400 miles from the museums holding their ancestors, people were still asking. The Hopi tribe, the Pueblo of Acoma, the Pueblo of Zuni, the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico, all federally recognized consulting parties under NAGPRA, were still asking. So here is where we are, entering the second half of this story. NAGPRA exists. The law is real. The database is public. The tribal claims are documented. The question is not whether these remains should be returned. Under federal law, they should. The question is, what mechanism, what pressure, what consequence finally forces compliance? And the answer, as of 2024, is still being tested in real time. To understand the full weight of this failure, you need to stand inside what was taken from. The roof beams at Cliff Palace recorded in their rings a sudden, sharp narrowing in the wood's annual growth. The Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona has read those rings. The drought began in 1276. It lasted 24 years, longer than most people's entire childhoods. Imagine every river, every spring, every aquifer in the American Southwest failing for longer than most children are young. The ancestral Puebloans at Cliff Palace faced that choice: stay in a canyon with no water or move. They moved south to the Rio Grande Valley, to the Hopi mesas, to where water still ran. The last construction at Cliff Palace dates precisely to 1276 CE, the drought's first year. Within one generation, every room was empty. The kiva fires were cold. The plazas held only wind. This was not mystery. This was not collapse. This was a rational decision made by a community that had survived 700 years in a desert. They carried their knowledge, their clan structures, their ceremonial traditions, their stories of the canyon they had built. They told their children. Their children told their children. The chain has never broken. When Tessie Naranjo of Santa Clara, Pueblo, says our ancestors are not specimens, they are our relatives, she is not speaking metaphorically. She is speaking precisely. Every day they remain in a museum box is a continued act of desecration. Tessie Naranjo, Santa Clara Pueblo scholar and NAGPRA advocate. Read that sentence again. A continued act of desecration, present tense, every single day, not historical, not resolved. Now consider the Italian comparison, because it clarifies the institutional logic being used against these tribes. Imagine if every cemetery in Italy had been excavated by foreign archaeologists, the bones shipped to museums abroad. Imagine Italy spending 34 years filing paperwork to get them back, while the museums cited with straight faces uncertainty about which Italian family they belonged to. That is, NAGPRA. That is the exact argument used for 3 decades against tribes whose clan records document direct ancestral lineage to these sites. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore, because the institutions knew. The records show they knew. The NAGPRA database is not classified. It is public. Any journalist, any senator, any student can read it. It shows, institution by institution, what each museum or university holds, and what has been returned. When researchers started reading those records carefully in the 2010s, a pattern emerged. Institutions holding ancestral Puebloan remains from documented excavation contexts, sites with paper trails, publication records, field notes going back to the 1890s were classifying those remains as culturally unidentifiable. In some cases, the same institution's own publications named the site, described the burial context, and connected the material to Pueblo ancestors. The right hand knew exactly what the left hand was classifying as unknowable. Richard Wetherell's own expedition notes from the Chaco Canyon digs describe burial contexts, associated ceramics, architectural locations, all the information needed to establish cultural affiliation. Those notes were in the American Museum of Natural History's own archive, the same institution that received the 90 crates he shipped from Chaco Canyon in the late 1890s. The bones from the same dig were in NAGPRA inventory as culturally unidentifiable. The 90 crates Wetherell shipped to New York remained subjects of NAGPRA claims well into the 21st century. That is more than a century between excavation and any prospect of return. 90,000 unreturned native remains across all U.S. institutions. That number needs a scale to land properly. 90,000, that is roughly the entire population of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Every single person. Reduced to a specimen number in a filing system, only approximately 10,300 have been returned since NAGPRA took effect in 1990. That is roughly 11% in 34 years under a mandatory federal law. Mandatory federal law. If 11% of a court-enforceable order had been complied with after 34 years, the non-complying party would face sanctions. NAGPRA carried no equivalent mechanism, and institutions understood that from the beginning. By 2022, the Biden administration had seen enough. In December of 2022, the administration proposed updated NAGPRA regulations, tighter timelines, shifted burden of proof, new consultation requirements. The proposed rule explicitly targeted the culturally unidentifiable classification as the primary mechanism of institutional evasion. On January 12, 2023, the revised regulations were finalized and published in the Federal Register. They took effect February 13, 2023. The new rule eliminated the culturally unidentifiable loophole. It no longer exists as a legal defense. It now requires institutions to consult with tribes before any scientific study of human remains, not after, not around it, before. That is a fundamental shift in who holds authority over these ancestors. Tribal nations no longer have to prove their connection to remains. Institutions now have to demonstrate why they should be allowed to keep them. This is the reversal that tribes have been demanding since before NAGPRA passed. And it took 33 years of institutional non-compliance to force the administration's hand on the Hopi mesas, in the Pueblo of Zuni, in the Rio Grande villages. People heard about the 2023 rule. They had heard about 1992. The ancestral Puebloan civilization occupied Mesa Verde for approximately 700 years. The Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and Pueblo nations have been waiting for their relatives to come home for approximately 130 years since Wetherell's first shovel went into the ground at Cliff Palace. Cliff Palace itself, 150 rooms, 23 kivas, engineered into the living rock of a sandstone canyon, has stood for more than 800 years. The people who built it have never gone anywhere. They moved south, as they had always adapted to changing conditions, and they are still there. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because the 2023 rule is being tested right now, and the results are not what the rule promised. As of 2024, approximately 90,000 native remains are still held in U.S. institutions, subject to NAGPRA or equivalent federal law. The 2023 rule revision is in effect. The loophole is closed on paper. Institutions are now required to halt scientific study of any native remains that lack proof of tribal consent. The compliance period triggered by the new rule is ongoing. Deadlines are active and institutions are scrambling. Some in good faith, others using the new timelines the same way they used the old ones, as a calendar for delay. No channel has traced the specific Mesa Verde excavated remains pulled from cliff-dwelling burial niches in the 1890s and 1930s through to their current inventory numbers in institutional paracorder setting databases. That trace exists. The NAGPRA database is public. The excavation field notes are archived. The chain of custody is documented. What that trace shows, when you follow it, is that specific bones from specific rooms in Cliff Palace are still in specific institution storage units in 2024. The Hopi tribe, the Pueblo of Zuni, the Pueblo of Acoma, and the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico remain federally recognized consulting parties on these materials. They are not waiting to be recognized. They were never not recognized. They have been legally standing parties under NAGPRA since November 16, 1990. That is 34 years of legal standing and approximately 88% non-return. The Smithsonian, operating under its own 1989 law rather than NAGPRA, still holds approximately 2,400 individuals affiliated with Pueblo peoples, including Four Corners excavations. The Smithsonian is not subject to the 2023 NAGPRA rule revision. It operates on its own timeline, under its own statute, with its own review processes, which means that for a significant portion of ancestral Puebloan remains in institutional hands, the 2023 rule provides no direct legal leverage. No direct leverage. 34 years in. The cliff dwellings themselves are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a major American tourist destination. Approximately 500,000 people visit Mesa Verde National Park every year. They walk through rooms that were built by the direct ancestors of people who are still waiting for those ancestors to come home. The National Park Service interpretive signs have improved significantly in recent years. They no longer say the ancestral Puebloans vanished. They now correctly explain the migration south, the drought, the living descendants. That is progress. The bones in the storage drawers are not progress. Inside a storage tray, in an institutional collection, an ancestral Puebloan adult, excavated from a burial niche in a cliff dwelling, catalogued with a specimen number. On the Hopi mesas, on the Rio Grande, in Zuni, in Acoma, people know that tray is there. They have filed the paperwork. They have documented the connection. They have done everything the law requires of them. The tray has not moved. This is not a historical injustice. Historical injustice is past. This is an ongoing, institutional decision, made every day. The tray stays on that shelf. Every day is a choice. The drawer is not locked. The law is not ambiguous. The descendants are not silent. What is missing is not documentation. What is missing is urgency on the institutional side. The Kennewick Man case, which delayed NAGPRA compliance broadly through the 2000s, ended in 2017 when the remains were finally returned and reburied. It took 21 years. The scientific community published extensively during that time. And then he went home. The lesson of Kennewick, if institutions were taking lessons, is that return is survivable for science and necessary for human dignity. That lesson has not generalized. The pattern with ancestral Puebloan remains continues. Pueblo tribal nations are currently engaged in active NAGPRA consultations with multiple institutions under the 2023 rule's new framework. Some of those consultations are producing movement, some are producing more paperwork. The 2023 rule requires action, but action has administrative definitions that can be stretched. The burden of proof has shifted to institutions, but shifting burden does not guarantee timeline. What has changed since 2023 is the political cost of public non-compliance. Institutions that appear in the NAGPRA database with large, unreturned inventories and documented tribal claims are now more visible than at any point since 1990. Journalists are reading the database. Tribal nations are publishing their own repatriation demand letters publicly. University students at institutions with large, unreturned inventories are organizing. The transparency that NAGPRA was supposed to create in 1990 is finally starting to function in 2024 through sustained public pressure and tribal-led visibility campaigns. Not institutional goodwill. That is the mechanism that is working. Not the law alone. The law plus attention. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde have been empty for 700 years. But the people who built them have never left. Their descendants are not petitioners. They are not applicants. They are the legal, documented, federally recognized next of kin. The NAGPRA database at nps.gov/NAGPRA is public, searchable, and updated. You can look up any institution tonight. You can see what your state's university museum holds. You can see what has been returned and what has not. You can see the gap between the law and the reality. It is not hidden. It is just not watched closely enough. The Hopi tribe, the Pueblo of Zuni, the Pueblo of Acoma, and the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico have been watching it for 34 years. The 2023 NAGPRA rule revision is the most significant change to the law since its passage. Whether it produces results depends entirely on whether institutions face consistent, documented, public scrutiny for non-compliance. That scrutiny is something anyone watching this video can participate in. The database is open. The records are there. Cliff Palace has stood for more than 800 years in the canyon where it was built. It is not going anywhere. Neither are the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande. They were never gone. The cliff dwellings held families once the smell of cedar smoke, the weight of a child on a mother's back, climbing stone steps worn smooth by 700 years of feet. That is what was taken from those burial niches. Not specimens, people. 90,000 people are waiting. The law says, return them. The descendants are named. The locations are known. The only thing the cliff dwellings have ever truly lost is the bones that were taken, and those have an address, a specimen number, and a tribe still asking. The drawer is not locked, someone just has to open it. The drawer is not locked, someone just has to open it. Inside that tray, an ancestral Puebloan adult, excavated from a burial niche in a cliff dwelling, cataloged with a specimen number. On the Hopi mesas, on the Rio Grande, in Zuni, in Acoma, people know that tray is there. They have filed the paperwork. They have documented the connection. They have done everything the law requires of them. The tray has not moved. This is not a historical injustice. Historical injustice is past. This is an ongoing institutional decision, made every day the tray stays on that shelf. Every day is a choice. The drawer is not locked. The law is not ambiguous. The descendants are not silent. What is missing is not documentation. What is missing is urgency on the institutional side. The Kennewick Man case, which delayed NAGPRA compliance broadly through the 2000s, ended in 2017, when the remains were finally returned and reburied. The only thing the cliff dwellings have ever truly lost is the bones that were taken, and those have an address, a specimen number, and a tribe still asking. The drawer is not locked, someone just has to open it.